E o nosso próximo painel é Liberdades, individuais e risco. Vou chamar o próximo palestrante, mas antes eu queria pedir para passar o vídeo do Brasil Paralelo, por favor. Muito bem. Eu queria chamar, então, o Tom Palmer, que é o doutor em Ciências Políticas, veio diretamente dos Estados Unidos para falar com a gente. Cadê ele?
Thank you very, very much. It was wonderful to listen to the previous robust conversation about such an important issue as freedom of speech. I've been on the road a great deal in the past months, notably in Ukraine, hence the Ukrainian flag. So I spent about 7 weeks delivering supplies, working with our liberal colleagues and friends in Ukraine, and then bringing out refugees who are fleeing a genocidal war. So I spent more time driving in about 7 weeks than I think in the previous 10 years. So it's wonderful to be in one place now for a whole week, and I'm very grateful for the invitation to join you in this amazing city of industry and commerce. I'm very grateful to the host, to Lucas Berlanzo, who reached out to me, to the estimable commercial and intellectual entrepreneur Salim Matar, who has helped to bring us here, to the many organizations involved in this conference, and to all of you, each and every one of you. Now, the topic that was suggested to me is rather broad, and it offers a variety of avenues to approach it. Individual liberty at risk. I'll start by taking it term by term. So the word individual is an adjective. In this case, it refers to each and every single person, taken one by one. Hence, we're interested in the liberty of each and every individual person. Now, the modifier, the word individual, can be used in other ways also, but here it's used to focus on the liberty of every person, taken as a unique entity. Now, there are antonyms or opposite words for individual when used in this context, and they include common, together, combined, shared, and collective. In the context of moral and political thought, the relevant antonym is collective. And thus we contrast individualism with collectivism, with each philosophy proposing a different foundation for moral and political justice and order. Individualists believe that individual human beings are foundational to moral and political justice and order. Groups, well, real, and not to be discounted as mere fictions, as sometimes happens, are not sources of moral significance in the same way that individual human beings are. And it's an important distinction. For collectivists, individual human beings, taken one by one, are analogous to the cells of an organism, each as a component part that functions to serve the whole organism. And each is subservient to the flourishing of the whole. Individuals in this collectivist mentality are dispensable. And real collectivists can commit genocide and murder, and they have no guilty conscience because nothing was lost. Nothing real was destroyed. Individuals are not as real as collectivities, in their viewpoint, because they believe that what is fundamentally real is not the individual entity, but forces such as classes, races, nations, and the like. And in the postmodern formulation of this collectivist mentality, the individual is merely the intersection point of forces that are more real than the concrete and unique individual. In contrast, for individualists, the group, whether it's a state, a nation, a community, a synagogue, a firm, a church, a union, or a club, is made up of individuals and their complex relationships among themselves. So a group isn't just a random collection of individuals. It's made up of individuals and their complex relationships, which distinguishes a church from a firm or a union or other kinds of human associations. So it's the individuals and their relationships that constitute the group. They are what is primary. It's true, and here we should concede to the collectivist mentality, if you will, the truth that individuals, each one of us, we're shaped and formed by the groups into which we're born and the groups with whom we associate. If you're born in Brazil, you'll probably have a different mentality than someone who's born in Korea, for example. So we can acknowledge and recognize that. But, and here's the important point, the group is not another individual with the same agency or ontological status as the members, the individuals that constitute the group. Individuals and groups differ in really important ways, which collectivists, in their ontological naivete, never understand. For example, a group of people lacks the self-consciousness and the moral agency of an individual. I will digress for a moment and notice something. Sometimes groups are ways that we escape our responsibility and we escape our moral agency by saying we were swept up in the group. The group did it. I didn't do it. And that's how, in many cases, horrifying crimes are committed. War crimes are committed. I didn't do it. I didn't kill those people. The army did it. We did it. No one ultimately is responsible. In addition, though, a group can outlive the individuals who make it up, as we see when churches and nations and corporations and other groups persist across generations. The individual members may die, but the company or the church or the association can continue on. But it does not make the group somehow morally superior to the individual, nor is the group an entity that exists independently of or separately from the individuals who constitute it. Now, one who understood this point very well from his own personal experience was a Ukrainian-born novelist named Vasily Grossman. Grossman spent his entire adult life under the collectivist regime of the Soviet Union. He never lived in anything approximating a free society. In one of his great novels, Life and Fate, set in the context of the siege of Stalingrad, he has one of his characters, Red Army Colonel Pyotr Pavlovich Novikov, inspect the soldiers under his command before they are going to go into battle. And as he prepares to address them, Colonel Novikov comes to a profound realization. In Grossman's words, human groupings have one main purpose: to assert everyone's right to be different, to be special, to think, feel, and live in his or her own way. People join together in order to win or to defend this right. But this is where a terrible, fateful error is born. The belief that these groupings, in the name of a race, a god, a party, or a state, are the very purpose of life, and not simply a means to an end. No. The only true and lasting meaning of the struggle for life lies in the individual, in his modest peculiarities, and in his right to those peculiarities. So our modest peculiarities and our right to them, that is what makes each one of us unique and not merely interchangeable parts of a whole, like Lego bricks and your children's toys. That is the focus of individualism. One of Brazil's great national heroes, in my opinion, made that plain in deeds and in words. The poet, diplomat, and committed abolitionist Joaquim Nabuco instructed us as individualists to educate our children and to educate ourselves, and I quote, in the love for the freedom of others. For only in this way will your own freedom not be a gratuitous gift from fate. You will be aware of its worth and will have the courage to defend it. That is to say, individualism is not the same as narrow selfishness. This is what collectivists accuse us of. They say, because you believe in the significance of the individual person, you are a selfish person. Exactly the opposite. It's the individualist who cares about the freedom of other people, not merely one's own. I don't have to be a Jew to be horrified by anti-Semitic pogroms. I don't have to be black to stand up against the Ku Klux Klan. I don't have to be, we could make a long list, any of those things to believe in the right of people to live their own lives without fear of violence or domination. It is the individualist who loves her own liberty, but loves it the more deeply because she loves the liberty of other people. Now let's think about human nature for a moment. We have, as it were, two natures. We have a common nature, that is to say, one that all of us share. To use Aristotle's phrase, we are zoon logon, usually translated as the rational animal, but it could also be translated, I think more usefully, as the animal that talks, the animal that has logos. But we're also social primates, we're mammals, we're living beings, and so on. That's our common nature. We also have, each one of us, our own individual natures that distinguish us. A great theorist on this question was Marcus Tullius Cicero. And in his book On Duties, a very important book, written at the end of his life when he knew he was going to be killed, it's a letter to his son about how to lead a good and dutiful life. He says, one must understand that we have been dressed, as it were, by nature for two roles. One is common, arising from the fact we all have a share in reason and in the superiority by which we surpass the brute creatures. The other, however, is that assigned specifically to us as individuals. For just as there are enormous bodily differences, some are taller, some are shorter, and so on, similarly, there are still greater differences in men's spirits. Now, an outcome of Cicero's view of this was a universal understanding of fundamental rights. As he concluded in a passage that was to be quoted many times in subsequent centuries. This book, by the way, is one of the most important in world history. It was the second most printed book in Europe after the Bible when movable type was introduced. And it had a profound influence on moral and political thought. He concluded all men should have this one object, that the benefit of each and the benefit of all together should be the same. Let me translate for a moment. It means we don't have necessarily contrasting or conflicting interests. It's possible to live together in peace and harmony. If anyone arrogates it to himself, all human intercourse will be dissolved. Furthermore, if nature prescribes that one man should want to consider the interest of another, whoever he may be, for the very reason that he is a man, we would say as a human being, it is necessary, according to the same nature, that what is beneficial to all is something common. Of course, we understand what is common and beneficial to all is liberty, the liberty of every person. But he continued, if that is so, then we are all constrained by one and the same law of nature. And if that also is true, then we are certainly forbidden by the law of nature from acting violently against another person. This passage in particular came to have an enormous impact on those who stood up to oppose enslavement and violence and persecution of others. We must be free to be true to both of our natures. Our common human nature as animals who talk, that is to say, we can converse, we can discuss, we can persuade one another, and not merely hit each other or use violence. We can talk with one another. We can learn from one another. But we also need to be free to fulfill our own unique individual natures and to live our own individual and unique lives. We must be free from violence from others, and thus, for us to be free, we are equally forbidden and restrained from acting violently against others. Now, Aristotle observed in his Politics, when he discusses democracy, and I should say as a digression, one must be very careful when reading Aristotle, what is his view and what is a view that he's reporting. And in this context, it's clear he's talking about what advocates of democracy believe. Doesn't mean it's necessarily what Aristotle believes. But he observed that in democracy, the regime in which we talk about things before embarking on common courses, there's discourse, and there's the protected right to discourse. The Cleisthenic reforms in Athens established isegoria, equality of speech, as the foundation of the political order. As he said, those who believe in democracy believe in liberty. Quote, "The basic premise of the democratic sort of regime is liberty, eleutheria in Greek. It is customarily said that only in this sort of regime do men partake of liberty, for, so it is asserted, every democracy aims at this. One aspect of freedom is being ruled and ruling in turn, not seizing all the power for yourself, but recognizing in an electoral system you might win today and you might lose tomorrow. Another is to live as one wants. For this, they assert, is the work of liberty, since not living as one wants is characteristic of a person who is enslaved. And this, then, is the second defining principle of democracy. It contributes in this way to the liberty that is based on equality. Now, we as individualists are concerned about the liberty of each individual in our countries, our communities, our societies. We're bearers of a common nature as rational animals, just as each of us is also characterized by our own modest peculiarities, to use Grossman's phrase, or by our differences in spirits, to use Cicero's. But now, what about liberty? What do we mean by liberty? Liberty is one of those essentially contested concepts that advocates of various political philosophies strive to appropriate for themselves. Other such essentially contested concepts are justice, equality, law, and even peace. Marxists and theocrats, fascists and socialists, populists and nationalists, and all of the combinations of the above, nationalists, Marxists, nationalist socialists, populist fascists, and so on, they all claim to be advocates of liberty. But they normally say, to distinguish it from the liberty that we advocate, we as liberals, theirs is a higher liberty, not the tawdry individual liberty that liberals want. We put liberty at the heart of our ideas by calling ourselves liberals, from the Latin word to be free. Now, liberty in that liberal tradition doesn't mean just doing whatever pops into your head. If you think you want to break a window and take something, you wouldn't say that that's just an exercise of liberty. That's what John Locke, who's a contributor to this liberal tradition, called license. And he distinguished license, doing whatever comes into your head, from liberty. The liberty that is advanced by liberals is precisely a condition of equality and fundamental moral and political status, and that means equal restraint and equal freedom. All of us are equally restrained in using violence or coercion against other people. So the enjoyment of liberty that we seek is not liberation from all constraints, from all morality, from all principles of justice, but rather mutual enjoyment of equal liberty. And that entails mutual restraint. John Locke put it so brilliantly in his second treatise. He said, the end of law, the purpose of law, is not to abolish or to restrain, but to preserve and enlarge freedom. Where there is no law, there is no freedom. For liberty is not to be free from restraint and violence from others, which cannot be, for liberty is to be free from restraint and violence from others, which cannot be where there is no law. Freedom is not, as we are told, a liberty for every man to do what he lists or whatever he wants to do. Who could be free when every other man's humor or whim might domineer over him? But a liberty to dispose and order as he lists, that is to say, as he wishes, his person, actions, possessions, and his whole property within the allowance of those laws under which he is, and therein, this is the key, not to be subject to the arbitrary will of another, but freely follow his own. So where there is no law, there is no freedom. I read those words a good 50 years ago as a student. And I admit that when I was that young, they didn't make a big impact on me. I thought, what is he talking about here? Where there is no law, there is no freedom. What it took was the experience of spending time in countries that did not have the rule of law to understand what Locke was getting at there. When you are subject to arbitrary power by others, you are not free. And law should not be misunderstood as a command or an edict, an ultimatum, all enforced by coercion, which is the way it is typically understood. As was once said, for my friends, everything, for my enemies, the law. In that case, law means just violence. But in the liberal tradition, law means rules, rules that are applicable to all. A free society is one in which all individuals enjoy equal liberty. The law is applicable equally to all. All existing polities approach those conditions to greater or lesser degree. There's none that is perfectly free in this sense. None at all. To greater or lesser degrees. But the principle of equal liberty under law provides a standard by which we can judge any existing political system. Finally, what does it mean for liberty to be at risk? Now, we understand risk to mean that something is threatened. That is to say, it is enjoyed now to some degree, even if imperfectly and unequally, and in future it might not be. So it's existing, but at risk. Now, all social and political orders are complex and variegated, so it's unreasonable to deploy the concept of liberty in just a binary manner. That is to say, you're either at liberty or not at liberty. The society has liberty or it doesn't. Most societies have more or less. Nonetheless, it's reasonable to establish, for taxonomic purposes, certain thresholds. So one could say, for example, that the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, also known as North Korea, is clearly a country where people do not enjoy individual liberty. I spent 10 days there some years ago, and it was clear everybody all the time is afraid. They are afraid constantly. Every moment of your life is spent in fear. In contrast, the Federative Republic of Brazil is a country in which individuals enjoy a very substantial amount of individual liberty, certainly by comparison to North Korea. Thus, one we call an unfree country, and the other, Brazil, is a free country. Even though I know on the margin you don't think there's enough, Brazil, in this context, is on the side of being a free country. We can also ask, though, whether liberty is at risk of being eroded at the margins, bit by bit by bit by bit, or threatened existentially at its core. Some countries see their liberty lost a little bit at a time, and other countries see it gone like that when they're invaded or conquered by a neighboring illiberal state or a domestic tyrant seizes power. Now, a very common approach to the problem here is to identify particular instantiations of liberty. And we've heard discussions on the stage here about economic freedoms and social freedoms and freedom of speech and religious freedoms and so on. We can call these liberties in the plural, and then ask whether this or that liberty is at risk. So some of the panels before, we heard very intelligent and thoughtful conversations about liberties that are at risk. We can distinguish economic liberties, religious liberties, social liberties, political liberties, and so on. And then ask, what is the risk each one faces? We can even go to a more granular level and identify certain acts, such as drinking alcohol, or smoking marijuana, or opening a restaurant, or selling cryptocurrency, or calling a special military operation a war, and ask whether the liberty to engage in them is at risk. I point out, in Russia, if you use the word war to describe the invasion of Ukraine, you go to prison for 15 years. We can also ask another important question that has been raised here: how are some liberties related to others? Perhaps some are foundational for others, such that their loss entails necessary loss to the others. Can there be liberty of the press, for example, if there's no liberty to acquire a printing press or to buy paper in order to express your ideas? Can there be liberty to follow your own will when there is, in Locke's term, when you are subject to the arbitrary will of another through unaccountable and therefore arbitrary political dictatorship? Are democratic liberties foundational for economic liberties, or is it the other way around? Or maybe they're mutually reinforcing. We do find them around the world conjoined pretty consistently: democratic liberties or democracy and market economy. Now, those are all reasonable and important questions, but there's a risk when we pose the question in that way. When we separate out a multitude of distinct liberties and then order them in importance and relate them one to another, and that is the risk of seeing each as a kind of discrete permission that is granted by the authorities of the state, who are therefore presumed to have the authority to grant or to deny permission. Now, this is an important point. It means, if we see liberties in this way, liberty is composed of liberties. Each one is a distinct moral or legal question to be answered in each case, perhaps even regarding each person. That view risks smuggling in a fundamental illiberal presumption, the presumption of the supreme authority of the state. And that presumption is fatal to liberty, and thus to all the particular liberties that we might enjoy. So that brings me to what I consider to be the core of liberalism. Liberty did indeed emerge out of liberties, the accumulation of a variety of liberties, what were called in law rights, privileges, and immunities. But if we just start with rights and privileges and immunities and ask which are granted and which are denied, we run the risk of setting the default presumption as a presumption of power. Now, to address that problem, the American founders in the U.S. Constitution proposed the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and the 9th and 10th are really the most important. Most people focus on the First Amendment, which was discussed earlier, about freedom of press and of religion and assembly and petitioning for redress of grievances and so on. but the 9th and 10th are the crowning glory and reflect the liberal perspective of the relationship between freedom and power. The 9th Amendment, the enumeration, that is to say, the listing in the Constitution of certain rights, shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. It tells us that merely because they made a list of rights and liberties, those are not the only ones you have. You have more. The 10th Amendment then complements it. Quote, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people." What does that tell us? It tells us that because we made a list of the rights of the state, those are all the ones they have. So notice the distinction. If we list the rights of the people, it does not mean it's the complete list. They have more. You cannot make a complete list of the liberties of the people. But you can make a complete list of the powers of the state. If the power is not on the list, they don't have it. Very clear language. Now then, the 14th Amendment, which was passed over after the horrifying Civil War that culminated in the abolition of slavery, explicitly forbid arbitrary powers to the state governments. Quote, "No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws." I'm not making an advertisement for the United States Constitution, which has its flaws, and which I do not offer as a universal template. For one thing, I consider strong presidential systems to be, in general, quite dangerous to liberty, because most countries don't have the benefit of having George Washington as their first president. Washington was famous for resigning. His greatest moments in political life were resigning. At the end of the War for Independence, he gave over his sword in a ceremony, and after 2 terms in office, they begged him to stay. He said, 8 years is long enough for anyone. I won't do it. And that set a pattern. Unfortunately, other countries don't get George Washington. They get Saddam Hussein or Vladimir Putin or Hugo Chavez, and a strong presidential system doesn't turn out so well in that context. Nonetheless, those amendments illustrate an underlying difference between liberal and illiberal approaches to law and government. Not in the hierarchies of liberties and powers that they prefer, but the fundamental presumptions regarding liberty and power. For liberals, it's a presumption of liberty. For illiberals, anti-liberals of all sorts, it's a presumption of power, even as they differ bitterly amongst themselves about which party or which cult should exercise the power. Now, we want to understand the presumption of liberty, distinguish it from the background presumption of power. Think of it this way. The medieval guilds in Europe exercised routinely the presumption of power. They could deny anyone the permission to enter a trade, right, of being a leather worker or a metal worker. The guilds had that power. You could be denied permission to enter it. Someone had the presumed authority to stop you. It was liberals who abolished that and said if you want to enter a trade, you should be presumed to be able or free to do that. And then people are free to buy or not buy from you. Similarly, we think about the burden of proof. The burden of proof should be on the one who would restrict your liberty, not the one who would exercise it. And harm to the rights of other people, negative externalities in economics terms, such as pollution, quickly come to mind as reasons that we would limit someone's exercise of a liberty if it was harmful to another. But as John Stuart Mill explained, there's no right to protection from criticism or from lawful competition only against force and fraud. Now, the economist and philosopher Anthony de Josset, I highly recommend his writings, a very careful analytical thinker, described the presumption of liberty as meaning that any act a person wishes to perform is considered to be permissible, not to be interfered with, or regulated, taxed, or punished, unless there is sufficient reason to show why it should not be permissible. Now, he explained that the presumption of liberty was a consequence of the different epistemic meanings of verification and falsification, so within context of philosophy of science. We can compare it to the attitude in a court of law. We have a presumption of liberty in social and political life, and a presumption of innocence in law. And they're grounded on the same principle of human knowledge. Just as the burden of proof is on the one who would deny liberty to another person, not the one who would exercise it, the burden of proof is on the prosecutor to show you are guilty. The burden is not on you to prove you're innocent, which in some cases is virtually impossible. So let's take a simple set of examples. Someone who wishes to sing a song, or bake a cake, or sell a flower should not have to begin by begging permission from someone else, from the ministry of singing, or baking, or flowers, which is unfortunately the case in many countries today. Nor should that person have to rebut all the possible reasons against singing, or baking, or selling flowers. If she is to be forbidden from singing, or baking, or selling, the one who seeks to forbid it bears the burden of showing why. And it might be something that could be discharged. For example, if the singing was to be at 3 o'clock in the morning in front of your house with a rock band and a loudspeaker, and it would keep the neighbors up. Or the baking might be generating sparks that would burn down the neighborhood. These would be good reasons to not allow that to happen. Or, in the case of selling flowers, well, I'll be honest, I can't think of any reason to stop someone from selling flowers. However, in most states of the United States of America, if you don't have a permission and license from the government, you're not allowed to sell flowers because of the power of the florists associations establishing state boards of florists who require you to go to school to learn how to put flowers together. And I mentioned this, there was a particular case of a woman who was arrested in Louisiana for selling 2 flowers rather than just 1. She was an illegal flower arranger, and she suffered consequences because of this, because she had not gone to school to know what colors of flowers should go together. So there may be good reasons for forbidding the singing or the baking, probably not for forbidding selling of flowers. But the burden is on the one who would show why not on the one who wants to do it. Former President Mauricio Macri this morning explained very eloquently about one of the dangers that liberty faces, the rise, again, of populism. And it is a major risk to liberty. The reason lies not just in the short-termism of populist policies, which is his primary focus, and I agree with him entirely about that. But there's another deeper level in which populism is harmful and it poses a risk to liberty. And that is the way in which populists deliberately, systematically, and consciously polarize and divide people into enemy camps. This is their modus operandi. Ernesto Laclau, the Argentinian theorist, a Peronist, a Marxist, and a fascist, who later reinvented himself as a post-Marxist, but in all of his life an enemy of liberalism and democracy and individual freedom. He wrote a book called On Populist Reason, and if you have a strong stomach, you should read this book. He said, in the case of populism, a frontier of exclusion divides society into two camps. The people, in that case, is something less than the totality of the members of the community. It is a partial component which nevertheless aspires to be conceived as the only legitimate totality. So focus on that. It's a portion of the population that is the only legitimate totality, which means the others are illegitimate. Anyone outside of that understanding is considered the enemy and completely illegitimate. A term that is used in Spain by one of his students, Inigo Errejón, who was a founder of Podemos, a radical populist party. He uses the term the casta to describe the enemy. The enemy is the casta. He was asked in an interview, who are the casta? His answer was quite interesting. The term's mobilizing power comes precisely from its lack of definition. It's like asking, who's the oligarchy? Who's the people? They are statistically indefinable. I think these are the poles with greatest performative capacity. In other words, the most useful for seizing power, which is the goal of the populist. He was interviewed by Chantal Mouffe, the wife of Ernesto Laclau, also a professor of political thought and a populist. And she, in the response, noted that when you designate the enemy, you create, quote, the sort of people we want to build. So the people is not all the people. It's not a pre-existing entity. You build the people when you designate the enemy, the 1%, the Jews, the immigrants, the foreigners, the Muslims, the homosexuals, whoever it is. You create the identity of the people by identifying the enemy, the unpeople, who have no legitimacy and therefore must be destroyed. When a group is designated as the enemy of the people, the next natural step is to deny them the right to exist, to nullify any possible exercise of their liberty. Or in Karl Marx's rather pregnant phrase, they must be made impossible. From the Communist Manifesto. The bourgeoisie must be made impossible. And indeed, people inspired by his ideology made millions and millions of people impossible. The polarization of the people that's driven by populism undermines and puts at risk liberty, whether we call them left-wing populists or right-wing populists. They deny the very possibility of pluralism, of different groups living together, different religions or races or ethnicities or whatever. That's what they attack. There's the true people and the enemy of the people. And that is the mobilizing power of their ideology. Or as Errejón put it, it has the performative capacity to drive them into power. So populism is a tool of dictators and would-be dictators to take power. It's not some kind of a popular ideology. It is an ideology of power. Now, to return to this presumption of liberty, some nice words about Brazil, in which people experience a great many infringements on their liberty, as I have heard today, and in which the presumption of power has been the default mentality of so many of its intellectual and political leaders. But recently took a step moving in the direction of the presumption of liberty. So the Economic Freedom Law of September 21, 2019, established in law a very important presumption that governs a wide swathe of regulatory activities. A presumption that one has liberty to innovate in business, a presumption that individuals interacting with the state do so in good faith, and should not be treated as guilty parties who must prove their innocence. And that law and the associated Declaration of Economic Freedom Rights, those are important steps forward in the achievement of liberty. Not because they articulate a list of specific permissions, but because they change the burden of justification. And that's acting at a deeper level. If we always had to prove ourselves innocent, we couldn't be said to live in a free society. if we have to prove why we should be allowed to do something, we're equally unfree. In the license raj in India that existed prior to 1991, if you had a little store and you wanted to move a machine from one side to another side, you had to get a permission. Everything required a permission. When they abolished much of that was when we saw this tremendous increase in prosperity in India. Now, another step is a principle: silence equals consent. If you do have to apply for permission and you don't hear within a certain amount of time, you get the permission. The burden is on them to respond to you and say, why not? Rather than running out the clock for months and months and years and years. Now, the passage of such a bold declaration in law is not the same as implementation. And that is something that's quite significant, particularly in a big country like Brazil. And I explained to my other foreign friends, being a foreigner myself, Brazil is not really a country. It's a whole world. It's a gigantic, complicated place. And to bring about implementation will take the effort of lots of people in Brazil, all across the country. So the Liberal Institute of Sao Paulo is undertaking this project, but people all across the country need to make sure it's implemented. The burdens placed on enterprise in Brazil are staggering. I'll end with two quick notes. I met an entrepreneur who took me aside to explain how hard it is to be an entrepreneur in Brazil. He said, in my restaurant, I don't just have to have soap in the kitchen. I need to have yellow soap, a particular color of yellow soap. He said, who knew that? I didn't know that when I started a business. And there are thousands of these rules. And they're not in one book called How to Run a Restaurant. They're all over the legal and regulatory code. So he says, I have to hire a lawyer who understands these things constantly whenever the inspectors come. That's what it is, as I understand, to open a business in Brazil and many other countries. Now, why do people do that? Why do they exercise power in that way? I learned years ago, when I was puzzled by this question, I asked my brother, who's a very wise person, I said, why do they do this? And he said, you want to know the answer? It's because they can. That's why they do it. It's because they can. And to enjoy liberty, we have to remove that power from them and from ourselves to deny permissions to other people. I mentioned the novelist Vasily Grossman. In his book, Forever Flowing, he said something that reminded me very much of what Salim Matar said this morning. He said, I used to think freedom was freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of conscience. But freedom is the whole life of everyone. Here's what it amounts to. You have to have the right to sow what you wish to make shoes or coats, to bake into bread the flour ground from the grain you have sown, and to sell it or not sell it as you wish. For the lathe operator, the steel worker, and the artist, it's a matter of being able to live as you wish and work as you wish and not as they order you to. And in our country, Soviet Union, there is no freedom, not for those who write books, nor for those who sow grain, nor for those who make shoes. So freedom is, as Salim Matar made clear this morning, the whole life of everyone. Thank you very much.